Something.
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 So John is planning on joining quite soon. He's gonna try to give a demo of the Fingerer.
Oh, great.
Excellent.
If the demo gods are in favor of his presence. You never know what's gonna happen in those cases, huh? So, what's new? So, hey Larry, I looked at those NRPN numbers that you mentioned for the Shruti.
Right.
Right? Which is actually something that I didn't know that existed in MIDI. They are, as you said, totally correct, non-registered parameter names or numbers. And the Eigenharp can't send them out right now. EigenD can't do it. Because the way it functions is that it kind of, it uses the CC method to, so it's got two CC messages, I think number 99 and number 98, to send out which parameter number you actually want to send the value for. So, so first that has to be sent out, and then you send out the value for that parameter. But that does mean that you have like 65,000 parameters that you can work with. But it also uses up, at least twice as much of the bandwidth.
Right.
So I'm not sure how well it is going to work, because I know that I'm sometimes already with regular CC. Once I'm doing 14-bit. It's very difficult for the hardware synths to actually keep up with it, and I have to decimate like crazy. So,
and I haven't found any way in Ableton to talk to those. I can talk to the standard CCs, no problem, but to do that, I think you might be able to do it if you get Max for live, but I haven't gotten to that point yet.
Well, Larry, one way to do it is to just make up the
Hello.
Good morning, Jessica.
Good morning.
Hello.
Is to just make up the file, like a file, like you would make up a SysX file with the thing you want to send. And then I think in Ableton you can just send that with a separate key.
Yes, but you're also supposed to use this for real-time control, Mike. It's like real-time control parameters.
Yeah, that would be a little overburdened.
I started looking into it because I was looking into the Dave Smith's Tetra synth, seeing how they did MIDI mapping, and they use it to actually be able to address all the parameters on each voice separately. So you kind of get a huge amount of parameters that have to be controllable. Sadly, though, they don't leverage the resolution of it, so almost all the parameters are limited to 120 values, which is a shame.
Yes.
It's really a shame, because you can't do this like a nice filter sweep. You're like stepping through discrete values of that, and so I sent a message to support there, and they said, well, we simply don't do it. So they don't do it. It's a shame, because otherwise it looks like a nice little synth that's with patches that you can save and program, and but sadly I don't think it's really suited for the Eigenharp.
This seems to be a reoccurring thing here.
Really?
Yeah, really. I think where have we seen this before?
So it is a very frustrating. It's like there is something missing in the market. So it's like we want CV. Oh, I want CV. Without actually going through MIDI, but I don't want any of the knobs of an analog synth. I just want to be able to use the sounds of the real analog synths, and be able to send those as patches from the computer or something like that. It doesn't even have to have its own patch storage. If it has that, well, all the better. But if it doesn't, you can always do that if it's controllable through the computer. But I can't find anything like it. It's either it does CV and does high resolution, and then You have to make sure that you know where all the knobs are. It will never be the same again. Hey, John.
Morning.
Morning.
And either it's the opposite way around. It's like fully digital, and then you don't get that resolution, which is it's a shame. I haven't found something that I fully like it.
Yeah.
What's with the Nord modular?
Sorry?
Nord has this modular synth thingy. I have only read a little bit about it, where you can make your patches on the computer loaded into the synth, and there it's played seemingly analog. People told me, I'm not sure.
Okay.
They are not made anymore, but they have these little red boxes which you actually can build your synth on the computer, load it into the modular, and play it there.
Well, we'll have to see.
And you can.
Yeah, sorry.
You can even the software. You can download it and test it.
The problem,
Yeah,
again,
they actually have.
is probably is going to be real-time control again, I suppose.
I think they just.
It may be worth a look.
Yes, I'm going to look. I'm actually looking at it now. See if I can find some more details about
Well,
it.
except getting a hold of one is not possible. I looked for a while, gave
Yes.
up.
Okay.
Europe is better. You can get some. There's people selling them.
Oh, good luck.
Yes. Yeah, who knows? Maybe something will come out at Musikmesse that does what I want. John, we can't hear you.
I don't see him.
You don't see him?
No?
There is, you should, John, on the right side there is this kind of thingy that looks like a gear, right on the top. And if you click on that, then you can do the audio settings and select where it gets its audio from and to.
Gert, are you getting your iPad 3 yet, or are you still waiting on that?
Actually, I don't think that I'm going to buy one.
No, you'll hang off on that? Okay.
Yeah. I don't know why. It's like, yes, it's an awesome upgrade. The screen is what makes the iPad, but then again, I'm like, I don't know. It doesn't excite me.
Okay. I haven't gotten one yet, so I saw that was coming out and I waited. I decided it looks like a good thing to wait for.
Well, you get one and tell us what you think about it.
Yeah. I haven't been able to figure out if it's compatible with the docking station you have, the Alesis.
I don't know. What the Alesis did for the iPad 2 though was they had this insert that they shipped with the docking station, so that it kind of makes up for the difference in height. Because the docking station is made for the iPad 1, which is quite a bit thicker. The iPad 2 is quite a bit thinner, and the iPad 3 is a little bit thicker than the iPad 2. So I suppose that they will just create another insert that you can put in the docking station.
Yeah, find out about that.
If it's still thinner than the iPad 1, what Alesis suggested before they had the shim out was to fold up a piece of paper and put it behind.
Yeah.
And that actually worked.
Yeah.
Good and high tech.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hey, there he is. Hi, John.
Hello, how are you?
Very good.
Kurt suggested that I might introduce you guys to Fingerer today, which didn't quite make it out on Friday. We were going to try and make a software release on Friday in the 2.0 branch, but we didn't quite make it because of some outstanding bugs that we didn't track down on Friday. But hopefully this week it'll be in. I think that's right, isn't it, Kurt? We're planning a release on Friday.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just thought it might be quite interesting for you guys, but I've got no idea how well this technology is going to work. So I've got EigenD running on this machine.
Yeah.
And is there any hope at all? You'll know this because you're good at these kind of things. Is there any hope at all they're going to hear any noise from this machine?
If it's going out through your speakers, they will hear something. Yes.
They'll hear something. Should we just give that a go? Do you
Yeah.
think?
Yeah. Just try it.
If everybody's interested, would everybody like to see some of this stuff, or
Sure, absolutely.
if we can tempt the technology, I think is the way to describe it. So let's just see if we've got any noise first.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, you're hearing.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is a very simple setup with the new finger in, which is set, I think, to a tin whistle fingering on this one.
John, can you maybe shift your camera that we can see your fingers?
Yeah, sorry, that's a terrible view, isn't it? Hang on a second. There we go. Now, if I fire Workbench up, this is going to be quite entertaining. Give me a second. I can change the fingering in here. We've defined some fingerings in here. There's a file format. This is going to be quite experimental when it comes out next week. And it's in the experimental release, so that's not terribly surprising. But give me a second. If I go to the finger can you do screen sharing with
Yeah, there
with
is
Hangout?
at the top left there's something called share screen.
Is that worth doing?
Yeah, it works very well.
Share screen. Okay, let's try that. I've pressed share screen, so I don't know if share screen.
And you will have another dialog that pops up asking you what you want to share, a window
yeah.
or the full screen.
It's pitiful. I'm feeling like a technical incompetent here. That's good.
Yeah, it works. One thing you have to know about though is with the screen sharing that it will not, if you're sharing a window, it will not share any of the pop-up dialogues. So.
Okay. That's a shame because
Yes.
that's really what I wanted to show you guys.
Yes,
actually.
I know.
So.
That's why I'm saying this.
Been there.
So anyway, I can go to the fingering, and we've got some defined fingerings in here. So I've got a very simple clarinet, and I've got one that's quite interesting, a grey code fingering. And I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with grey code. The programmers amongst you probably are. And a grey code fingering is a fingering, or a grey code in general is a binary code where every transition only has one bit that changes, so one key that changes when it translates into a fingering. So we've actually got a grey code fingering here, which is Sorry, I can't remember how to play a scale in it now, which is terrible. So we have a variety of different fingerings. They're all defined in a text file, so you can define your own fingerings very, very simply. And if I can just pull that text file up, I think, actually.
Yeah, you can share that window again with the text file, and then people will be able to
that's
see.
what I'm going to try and do. So hang on a minute. And that would be... Oh, crikey, where does that live, Kurt? That's in somewhere strange, isn't it? Where is it installed in the application? Can you remember?
Is this an installed version or is this from the source code?
Yeah, it's an installed version. This is installed in the actual. This is in the when this will live with the actual Python. So
Yeah, hang on. I'm going to find it.
I have been too lazy to actually document this properly on the wiki yet. So I am promising to do that. I can see Mike glaring at me with a
You should
beady eye, which is encouraging me to do that.
Yeah, /user/py/release and then the version.
Yeah.
And then it kind of depends on where you put the fingerings, because I have not looked at.
Well, they'll be in with the actual. They'll be in with the actual module, which is.
Then it's inside modules. You see modules directory there.
Oh no, that won't be there, will it? Because in fact, actually, this is not a release yet.
No, you haven't released it yet, so it will probably be in the source.
Yeah, it'll be in the source tree. Yeah,
Yep.
So okay, I'll go and find it there.
I thought you built yourself an installer and installed it.
No, I'm not. No. Too much hard work that is for me. Yeah. Okay, now this is going to be a little bit techie looking, I think, for everybody, but
So you'll have to reshare that window. Yeah.
I'm just pulling that one up. So, can everybody see that now?
It's coming through. It's a little bit slow, but it's... Yes, it's visible.
Yes.
So this is a text file that you'll be able to edit in any text editor. So just Notepad on Windows, really, or if you've got a better text editor, you can use that. And it's actually quite a straightforward format because you define each finger pattern and the offset in the scale that you want that finger pattern to produce. So at the top of this file, you can see a simple whistle pattern, which is just 7 fingers, well, 7 fingering patterns, one of which happens to be open, which is all the fingers removed, which is just an ascending scale. But you can also, in the fingerings, you can have additions. So you can have keys that modify the bass scale. And in fact, those can be fingerings as well, the additions. And they modify the bass scale by adding or subtracting from a scale interval. And then there are also polyphony modifiers. So you can add polyphony while you're playing. And the pressure of the polyphony key changes the amount of that harmony that you're introducing. And so I've got some fingerings further down defined that have a 3rd and a 5th and a 7th as polyphony options, so you can harmonize with yourself as you're playing. And all this happens because this is pre the scaler, so this happens in whatever scale you happen to be playing. So if you're on a diatonic scale, straightforward major scale, it's quite comfortable to play. It's very familiar for wind players. But you can also go into crazy scales, and I'm not quite sure what the effects of that are going to be. I think that's going to be quite an interesting kind of experimental avenue for people that are familiar with wind instruments. So I have to say it's been quite an interesting journey for me, realizing just quite how insane traditional wind instruments are in terms of fingering. When I discovered the clarinet fingering, it was a bit of a sort of how on earth does anybody ever learn to play these instruments moment for me. It was quite peculiar. So, but we do have a pressed clarinet fingering. And I know, Mike, that you suggested that I have a little bit of a look at the WX5 fingering, so I've got one of those just in gestation, which I hope to get in before we actually put a release out. And there's 2 files. Sorry, Mike.
Well, I only suggested that because it's immediately transferable skill.
Yeah. Well, I think it would be nice to put that in. I'm going to try and put a WX5 fingering in, probably saxophone A, which I've got the WX5 manual now, and I've been poring over it. Probably saxophone A. But there's no limit to the amount of fingerings that we can put in here.
Sure.
And there's 2 files. There's a factory file, which you don't edit, but there's also a user fingerings file, which goes in your user library, in your home directory /library/eigenlab/fingerer. And that file you can play with to your heart's content and add fingerings and mess around with it. So I'd like to encourage everybody here to have a bit of a go with it when it comes out in the release and experiment with some fingerings before it all gets fossilized, before we do a final release. I think it might be quite interesting to see what you guys come up with, because I've sort of reached the limit of my understanding of fingerings and what goes on with them. So,
I think that Oberon will have quite some interesting things to say about that.
Yes, he plays a lot of wind instruments, doesn't he?
Yes.
So that's his natural way of playing, really. So, Mike, are you a player? You play a wind instrument as well, don't you?
Well, I play a WX7 and a WX5, which are slightly different, but not materially different.
Right.
I started music on the clarinet.
So
That's my excuse.
So based on for me too, because I've never actually looked in detail at that file, that fingerings file. So I'm just to make sure that I understand what I was seeing. So for each fingering that is defined, there's the name, which is similar as when we define scales in the user scale definition, and then you can say which position that is pressed down. Is that it? The key that you press down, the position of the key? That's the number with the commas. Is that the position, the XY position of the key?
That's the course and the key. So you have 4 basic concepts in the fingering file. You have the base fingerings, you have additions to those fingerings, you have modifiers from those fingerings, and you also have polyphony modifiers to the fingerings. So the base fingerings themselves are defined by giving a fingering number, so fingering 1, fingering 2. That's just that's kind of syntactic necessity, but it's pretty boring. And then after that, you have a list of numbers, and they're comma-separated pairs of numbers, which are course and key. So that identifies the course you're playing and the key you're playing for that key to be active. The keyword open means that this fingering is valid when there's no keys pressed. So then you can label your number of keys. So if you look at the sort of third line down there, you can see finger 2, which is just naming the fingering, equals, and then it says 1, 1, which means course 1, key 1, and space 1, 2, which means course 1, key 2. And then there's a bit of white space, which you can be as large or small as you like, and then an asterisk, a star, and then it says +6.0, which means that when I've got keys 1 and 2 down, I want to have 6 scale increments played on my fingering from the tonic in whatever the scalar happens to be driven by at the time. That's a floating point number, so you can actually have 6.5 if you want. When I say scale increments, we've made a number of changes to the system in here as well, which means that we've also made scale increments floating point numbers. So they're actually, you can have fractional scale increments now before the scalar, which is kind of cool, actually. You can do some very weird things with it. The second conceptual thing, the other thing to mention about the fingerings as well is that unlike the WX5, WX7, EWI, and all these kind of things, and this was the really difficult thing about the actual program, writing the actual agent, is that fingerings move smoothly between each fingering and another fingering. So as you move from, say, a fingering which has just got 1 key down, 1, 1, to a key to where you've got 1, 1 down and 1, 2 down, if you're going between the 6th and 5th scale interval, the note will slide between the 6th and 5th scale intervals as you finger the second fingering more strongly. So in just the same way that you can bend notes on a tin whistle or a clarinet by partially opening holes, you can do exactly the same thing in this agent. You can bend notes around by partially fingering fingerings, which does make some quite odd and quite expressive results in my experience so far. I don't think I've got to the bottom of it yet, but you can do some quite odd things.
Yeah, that would also help you
that sounds cool.
not having a bite sensor. In effect, you're using the pressure to replace the bite sensor on an EWI.
I guess so. I guess that's one way to look at it. And the pressure sensor, when you're blowing, does the envelope, so you can make that drive the envelope if you want. So the second big conceptual thing is the addition line. And what additions are modifiers to that note that you've produced with the bass fingering. And that note that you're producing with the bass fingering is monophonic, so it generates one output note. And then the addition adds to that, or subtracts to it if you've got a negative addition. And that takes another fingering, which can be another set of keys, and that then takes that number and just adds it on. So if you've got an addition which is, say, for example, course 2, key 1, when you press course 2, key 1, that will add, depending on how well fingered it is, that will then add on the increment you define for that. So if you define, for example, +7, that'll put 7 diatonic, if you're in diatonic scale, 7 diatonic note increments on top of that. The third conceptual thing is actually wholly new in Eigen-D, which is the modifier. And that actually drives a whole new signal into the scalar. We've defined a new kind of thing, and Jim did this, which is a modifier input. And a modifier to a scale takes the existing scale and defines an increment off the actual scale note that you're playing. Now, at the moment, that has been quite crudely put in that it's actually fixed at a semitone. But we intend to make that part of the scales file shortly, so you can have different increments for different scale intervals. The advantage of that is that it always, at the moment, gives you a semitone increment, so it's not connected with the actual scale. It's a separate increment from the musical scale that you happen to be in. So you can use that to produce a key that flattens or sharpens the bass note by semitone, which is dead handy. Which means you can then play fully chromatically, even if you're in a diatonic scale on the scalar.
It also gives you a trill. Sorry, it also gives you a trill key, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it gives you that. So, and the fourth concept in the file is the polyphonic additions, which actually generate new notes, and this is quite a new thing, which is that as you press them, the fingerer will create new notes for you with intervals off of the bass note that's been defined, and the bass note is actually taken from the fingering plus the modifiers that have been applied to it, and then it takes that note and applies whatever polyphonic interval you happen to define. And you can define as many polyphonic keys as you want. So you can define complete chordal arrangements, which are just off these keys. And the amount they're actually playing by is dependent on the pressure of the key. So if you, for example, were to play play the tonic in the fingering, and then press the third and the fifth and the seventh, then you're going to get a triad and the seventh coming out of the other end. So it gives you a lot of musical opportunities. And as you modify the tonic, of course, that will step up the scale increments, so you can actually play chordal progressions using fingerings.
That's brilliant.
And I think that's... Yeah. Sorry, Mike.
Well, I just said that's absolutely brilliant. It'd be an interesting way to play from lead sheets and things, because you really just construct the chord, right?
Yeah, you can basically do that. You can construct the chord, and yeah, when you play, it's quite strange. I have to say, I'm really looking forward to the reaction of you guys to see how you play with it now, and I'd really, really encourage everybody to have as much of a play with it while we're still in the experimental phase, because I'm aware these things become set in stone very rapidly. And as soon as we get anywhere near, we're sort of racing towards a full release of 2.0 now. And I'd really, really like to find out whether or not Fingerer has got any real stupidities in it. And they're conceptual, I suspect. If there's any errors in there, they're going to be things that we just missed. There's already been about 4 or 5 quite major changes to it, as we realized we had sort of Homer Simpson doch moments as we were going through the development process. So, but I'd really encourage people to have a go, and try defining your own scales in the scale file as well. It does give you a little pop-up GUI dialog if you make a syntax error in the scale file, and to reload the scale file, all you have to do is reset the actual fingering in Workbench. There's a little drop down. It gives you a sort of a selection list of the fingerings that are present in your user scales file and in the factory fingerings file to select from. So have fun, guys.
Yeah, that looks really,
We will.
really interesting.
Yeah, that polyphony thing is. I wasn't aware of that. That looks
okay.
awesome.
Yeah, Kurt's about as he's not. I've only actually just merged the code branch back into the main code line, so you haven't really had to play with it either, have you?
Yeah,
I don't think. No.
I don't think I would have expected this to be a nice alternative to playing a standard sort of piano keyboard, but it could be, because basically, you've got your bass note and then you construct a chord around it, and it might be a really easy way to make amazing stretches, which would be very difficult on a piano keyboard.
I think it'll be a kind of fun way to discover chord progressions. I think that's going to be, especially with some of the slightly weirder fingerings that you can define. I mean, the grade code fingering sort of leads you into some very strange places quite rapidly. It's not the most intuitive thing in the whole world, I don't think, but it's quite efficient, which is, of course, what it was designed to be, I guess, by computer scientists. But grey code, interestingly, and this was Jim's idea, was invented originally because computers had lots of relays in them, mechanical relays. And if lots and lots of relays all went clunk at the same time, the fuses would blow. And so grey code was designed as a binary representation to cut down the number of transitions, of relay transitions that happened as counters counted up. But it actually works quite oddly well as a fingering, because you only ever have to move one finger to move one scale increment up or down, which is kind of weird. It makes trilling terrifically easy between odd notes. So.
Oh, that'll be fun to play with.
Yeah, I think, have fun defining your own as well. I'm really looking forward to seeing what people come up with, I think, in terms of fingerings for it. So. And I'm intrigued as well to discover the way the algorithm works, when you're doing transitions between one fingering and another, the whole problem in our world is that I wanted to give people the flexibility, the sort of smooth transitions from fingering to fingering that the eigenharp ought to be able to deliver, which means that each fingering has to have a weight. And that basically means how well fingered is that fingering. And when the algorithm works, it calculates that, and then it basically adds all the weights, gets a mean average of all the weights, the weightedness of each fingering, and what scale increment you're looking for from that fingering, and then figures out which note you're supposed to be on, or which frequency, which sort of scale increment you're supposed to be outputting. It's quite weird, and it does mean that the way that you define your fingering makes quite a big difference to what happens as you go between notes, because what I do at the moment is choose the largest number of keys down as the most important fingering, and then it gets less and less important as your number of keys down goes down. And once you've got a fully active fingering, it discards everything below that in terms of sort of sub-fingerings of fingerings. It sounds a bit complicated and weird. It is a bit complicated and weird, and it has some odd artifacts that pop out of the woodwork as you start to play with it. And I'm intrigued to see. Once again, I say I'm really intrigued to see what you guys come up with when you start playing around with it. So.
Yes, and I think the polyphony thing will make the Pico a lot more useful to a lot of people. Certainly, if they're using traditional chord progressions and intervals. As you said, Mike, it's an easy way to just read from a lead sheet and say, okay, I want to build a chord on that bass note and go off of
Sure.
that. Yep.
Use one course for bass notes and the other course for your intervals in your chord.
Yep.
You could really just play anything, right?
Yes. That goes back to. Did you? There was someone that mentioned that sort of new instrument that worked with intervals. Did you? Who mentioned that on Google Plus?
I
What's
saw that. That looked kind of cool, actually.
Yeah.
Didn't look into it. I kind of forgot about it. But it's kind of how I imagine that it would work. That you can kind of say what the distance is from a bass note.
No, it was cleverer than that, Kurt. It was cleverer than that. It was stateful depending upon where your note. It remembered the note you were on, and the intervals were based off the note you were already on. So it was like a walking journey, which actually is quite a cool idea, because if you're on a note, tension, resolution, all that stuff that composition uses matters. It matters which note you're on at the moment, what interval you're going to play next, and that was how that thing worked. It was quite strange musically. I thought it might make a very interesting Agent Freigen do that concept at some point.
What's amusing is that it is implementable as just yet another agent. I mean, it's not like it's rocket science when somebody shows it to you.
No, it's just an interesting idea, because it's based on the idea of where you are right now being important, rather than actually, rather than the overall harmonic structure. And there's all sorts of music that uses that idea very cleverly. So.
Cool.
Oh, the other thing I forgot to mention about Fingerer is that there's a threshold for the fingerings that's settable in the agent that you'll discover. I've set that to 0.1, so it uses 10% of the key value as a fully down key. I found when I was using it that if keys had to be fully pressed, that got very wearing quite rapidly to make fingerings. But it means if you want EWI or WX7 style behavior from it, all you have to do is turn that down to 0, or just a very tiny number, 0.001, and then just touching the keys fully fingers them. But as you turn that up, it gets more and more expressive, because the fingerings become more and more difficult to actually fully key accurately, and you have to be more careful about doing that. So you can tinker with that. That's just a parameter in the agent. So.
Cool. Is that?
Do all you guys have a Pico?
Yeah, mine's actually out on loan, and Dracula, yours is too, isn't it?
No, mine came back. But I probably will give it on loan soon again.
Yeah, Larry, you don't have one, right?
No, I only have one Eigenharp. Still haven't gone to multi-owner yet.
Well, I think that on the alpha, this is going to be very interesting if you start using keyboard splits.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought so too. So you can use one keyboard split to have now a lot more notes than you actually have keys, and do other fun stuff with the rest of your keys.
Yes.
Well, and as we were talking about, I think it was on the forum, you could take, say, 2 courses, one on either side of the alpha, and use it as 2 completely separate instruments. Like, in other words, divide up the courses vertically instead of horizontally.
Yeah. The other interesting thing is with the grey code fingering, you get over 30 notes of range, and that's 30 notes in scale, with just 8 keys, with 2 sets of 4. So you can basically, and if you add a couple of more keys to that, you can get huge ranges from tiny amounts of keys, and you can still have room to put the polyphony modifiers in and the semitone offset, so you can get fully chromatic and polyphonic playing in a chordal sense with one literally 4x4 key group would give you all that with loads to spare. Which on an alpha is quite exciting, I think. That's quite an interesting idea.
Wow.
Yeah, the limitation there probably isn't the keyboard in my case.
I was thinking the same thing.
Not in any of our cases, I think, Mike.
It's going to be interesting to see how people are going to pick up these new ways of playing actually that come out of that. How easy it is going to be, because this is going to dramatically change the finger patterns that you learn and that you start using on the Eigenharp, and also the way you think about things, because currently you still think as one key is one note, and thinking about it differently. I'm curious to see how easy it will be for people to pick that up based on their current Eigenharp skill. And maybe once 2.0 gets out in stable, see what new people will latch onto more easily. The finger playing.
It does look like it would be an easy transition for an iWii player, and I have to dig up those two guys I demoed the alpha for when I first got it. They were quite intrigued, but they didn't. It was early days at that point, so it was for me, as in addition to the instrument, and it was difficult to show them some of this stuff. But we had a great day. The one guy was a professor emeritus at U of T's Faculty of Music, and he just started killing himself laughing, and he said, I envisage in a couple of years you'll have people who are masters of this, and no one will be able to pick up their instrument and play it, because it'll be uniquely theirs. But he got it really quick.
Yeah, I have to say that that Jim came up last week with a slightly mad chord generator idea that actually could be very exciting, and I'm not going to share too much about that because obviously it's just a vaporware and I'm
Sure.
fairly allergic to that. But no, there are, as soon as you start thinking about chordal playing using small numbers of keys, all sorts of strange ideas pop out of the woodwork. And now we have a framework for doing that. And one of the big things with Fingerer was it does something that we don't normally do, which is generate new notes from an incoming set of data. So now we've actually got a bit of a sort of framework for doing that. I think it's going to be quite a lot easier to explore some of this stuff. So.
Yeah, it also really shows off the notion of not necessarily being a particularly percussive model, of sliding from notes to notes, of blowing the envelopes, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, I was quite keen on that. I mean, it's interesting. Tin Whistle, I think, is quite fun to play. I can't play it for toffee, really, but I love that thing where you can bend notes long ways by partially fingering holes. It's basically, it turns the Tin Whistle from being what to you would be a sort of $5 thing into being something beautiful, and something quite remarkable. And that, for me, is part of the essence of music as well. And so many of the fingered instruments in the electronic world are treated the fingering things as switches. I think incredibly dull. But you have to do that with MIDI. There's a conceptual problem with MIDI, which is that because the note starts with a pitch, all of those instruments have big lag. They have a big latency, and you probably experienced this with the WX5 mic as well, the WX7, is they have to actually wait until the fingering's stable. So they have to wait probably somewhere between 20 and 50 milliseconds after you fingered the note before they try and output the actual value. And that makes them, I found, very clunky and quite hard to learn because you have to anticipate the note so much.
Yeah, that's particularly true if you're using sort of traditional plugins. Their plugins, their physical model plugins, I've never quite figured out how they actually cause the attack to happen. They're almost unplayable on a keyboard, but they work very, very well on the WX series instruments. So they're doing something strange there.
Do they have their own software like Eigendy where this stuff is hosted in, or is this triggered through MIDI also?
It's purely MIDI. But because they have the breath control, you can actually watch that the way you are, instead of watching a note on and note off.
Mm-hmm. All right.
And I know their VL definitely watches breath to do some of their attack stuff. Their note, their envelope starts. But anyways, it'll be. This looks great. Looks fascinating. The part I can't get out of my head is the idea of constructing chords off a bass note, because it's just so straightforward, right? To do that. Sorry, that's my dog.
I think that for a lot of things that will that actually simplifies it enormously. The first step being what was having this fixed diatonic scale, where you know that certain patterns will always yield certain chords, but still having a fixed set of keys, it always creates certain intervals based on whatever you're playing as a bass note. I think that is really gonna, first of all, make music much more understandable to a lot of people, because that's actually how you think about it for a lot of modern music.
I think we may have missed a thing here as well. I think you guys may have missed a thing here, which is that as part of this, Jim has put this modifier input into the scaler. And I know that lots of people commented on playing in scale, wanting to have accidentals off that over the last couple of... Well, that basically gives you that.
Sure.
I don't know if... you could probably drive that off a key, couldn't you, Kurt? The modifier input? How would you do that?
Yeah, you can.
It's just an 0-to-1 value.
Yeah.
So.
But it's monophonic at the moment, isn't it? That particular... it's going to shift the whole scale down, right?
It shifts the whole scale. No, I don't think so. I think it can be correlated by key, I think.
Really?
I don't know, actually. That's a good question. I have no idea.
Actually,
about that.
Yeah, it would be interesting to do both.
Yeah.
So it might be interesting to finger a bass note and a set of intervals and shift them all, or just shift the bass note.
Yes, or even any of the other notes of the chord.
Yeah.
See someone going through sevenths and
In fact,
doing some resolutions. And
really, there's a lot of songs that do exactly that, right? Like you basically have when you start on a chord, it's a bass note in the chord, and then you move the melody note around within that chord until you decide to go somewhere else, right?
Yes.
There's a lot of songs.
Right. I don't think I'm going to do that tomorrow, Mike.
Well, I'm thinking of really simple pop songs like American Pie that has some of that kind of chord traveling in it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just quickly looking if I can see how it's implemented.
Oh, don't look at the code, Kurt. It's not the prettiest thing in the whole world. It's the first C++ I've written since 1996.
I'm looking at what Jim did to
Fortran.
the scaler.
No, I should have written it in Fortran for a proper old time's sake, Mike.
Yeah, right. While you're at it, why not try Pascal?
I wrote my first computer programs in Fortran actually, and this is going to make anybody actually younger than a certain age fairly astonished, as I wrote them actually on paper, and then we had to punch them onto punch cards with a little machine, Pachonka, as we actually punched them on the punch cards, and then we would pass out the punch cards in a jiffy bag and send the punch cards off to the university where they had a mainframe, where they would put the punch cards in the mainframe later that week, and then they would run the program on our punch cards and take the printout, which is on giant wide sort of lined paper, and then they put that in an envelope with our name on, and they would send it back to us in the computer lab at school. And most of the time that paper would come back after a week, and it just said at the top, syntax error.
Yeah. Very familiar sounding.
Yeah, it was a little less immediate than editing software today, I have to say. So.
It's funny because I somehow started like that also because I couldn't afford a computer, but I loved the idea of programming on a computer, so I bought a couple of programming books when I was a kid, and I read through them and I imagined what it would do, and then started writing on a piece of paper what I thought that I had to write to create a program, but it was only months later before I could actually test them out. So I had this whole pile of paper with just programs written out without actually having ever typed anything in on a computer. It was quite fun to try them out.
Insane. That's fantastically insane. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I had to do that too.
I think almost none of it worked.
No, my mother was like, no computer will enter this household. And for 2 years, I just chipped away at her insistence. And since I didn't stop reading my book and writing programs and showing her, after 2 years, she thought that maybe we could have this thing come into our home. And so I was allowed to get one.
That's cool.
What one did you get?
A Commodore 128.
Oh, yeah.
The problem was nobody in my family even knew what a computer was. I mean, they knew what a computer was, this big machine, yeah. But we were going to the to the store where they sold these thingies, and I mean, I didn't have no clue. My mother didn't have any clue. Yeah, so we just got what the guy said we should get.
It's a very cool computer for the time. Yeah.
That was a great.
Yeah.
And then I didn't get it to work.
I love my Commodore 64.
Yeah. The 128 was actually when I first encountered the DOS system, which was a year later. It was very cool because it had the CP/M stuff, and this worked. I mean, Gert, you know, the C64 had only this basic stuff, you know, and this was pretty easy, but it wasn't like the DOS system of these times. It didn't have a command line, but the C128 had the CP/M stuff, which was like the command line, and you could type in help, and it would tell you stuff like deer and so on, and.
I never had a Commodore 128. I stuck with my 64 for a long time.
No, but I understand what you're saying. When you go from I'm going to load a program, which means that's all that's there and that's what runs, to something that actually has an operating system, it's sort of it's quite marvelous.
Yeah, I mean I had this summer job, and this was on a DOS machine. And my colleague knew how to operate this stuff, and he didn't show me. So I had one night, I started up the CP/M stuff, and in one night I tried to find out as much as possible to beat him.
When I was at school, we had an electronics club, and there were 2 kids in the year below me at school. They were friends of my brother, in fact, and I still know one of them very well. He's a musician, and he designs games for a living now. And when they were 16, 17 years old, so basically the year I left school, they made millions of pounds, and I'm not exaggerating. It was literally millions of pounds, because one of them figured out that when you were writing a Commodore 64 game, the big problem was at the time is that there was no development kit for the Commodore 64 for software developers. And with just 64K of memory in the base machine, you had to put your development system and your assembler, because it was all written in assembly in those days, in the same memory footprint that you then had for your subsequent game, which meant that the number of games, you know, the kind of style of games you could write was very, very restricted. And so he did an absolutely hideous thing, which is he took 2 Commodore 64s, and where he got the second one for is anybody's guess. And with lots and lots of tiny little wires, he took the entire data bus and he wired the 2 data buses together. And then he wired the 2 address buses together. But he wired them together using transistor buffers on one side. So they were stronger in one Commodore 64 in terms of current capacity than the other. And then they found that what they could do was fire one up with the development system on, and then literally jam the buses on the other computer with higher current drivers, and load all the software from the development machine in 2 banks into the other machine, so they could write a game suddenly for the Commodore 64 that used the entire 64K of memory, for the program, rather than having to accommodate the assembler and all the other development stuff that there had to be. And they wrote 2 games with this, and the second game they wrote became a hit, and it became #1 in the games chart in the UK. And the next time I saw Chris and John, quite literally, Chris was driving around in a Lotus sports car at 18 years old. It was the most surreal moment, because they were a pair of utter wasters at school. You know, they were the 2 of the sort of, all they did was fool about. You know, they didn't study anything, they didn't work very hard, you know, they just fooled about. But it turned out the kind of fooling about they did was really important fooling about. You know, one of those very curious little stories about people getting rich when they're very young. Of course, they blew it all as well, very quickly. But Commodore 64. I've still got one of those in my barn somewhere, I think.
Yeah, sadly,
Yeah,
I lost
amazing.
all of that. Had a flooding in one of my basements, and all my old computer gear was just filled with sewer waste.
Oh, ooh.
Oh.
Yes, and just,
As salt
if it
mine.
would just been water, maybe something would have been able to be done, but sewer stuff. So yes, it's a shame.
I sold mine for the next machine.
Right.
I needed a cash to get my 386.
Actually, my first computer ended up in the bottom of a wheelchair. I gave it to a guy who wanted to use it to automate wheelchairs.
Okay.
Seemed worthwhile.
It is good cause.
Yeah.
What is that,
That
Larry?
looks like an apple, Larry. No, what's that, Ed? What is that? TRS-80?
No, that's just a circuit board with RCA 1802 in it. Hexadecimal keypad entry. You entered the program in byte by byte, and then you flip it over to the run position after you went to the load position.
Yeah, I wish I still had the Altair that I had once upon a time. Yeah, same thing. It just had flip switches.
Very primitive.
I have a small collection of that kind of old computer junk in my barn, amongst which is a real dinosaur. I have a VAX 11780 with a removable disk pack, which I bought at an auction for £50, and it's enormous, and it's all wire-wrapped, discrete logic inside, so it's a bit slice processor, which is all implemented in 7.4 logic. It's absolutely astonishing machine, and the disk packs are about 1.5 feet across, and you drop them in from the top of the unit, and then you turn them through 180 degrees, and you push a big red button on the front of the disk drive. The disks spin up, and then you have to wait 30 seconds while the dust is spun off the platters, and you push a green button, and the heads come out and engage with an enormous clunking noise. And that's for a whole 300 megabytes of storage, which in its day was revolutionary. But now,
300, yeah.
sadly, a bit pitiful, doesn't it? So,
There's another piece of gadget for you.
A core.
core
Love
memory.
Core.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
That's from a UNIVAC 3, actually, which I used to run. And the company I worked for had one of the very first, a thing called a fast RAND, which was a random access device. It was a cylinder. It was sort of a huge Edison cylinder, like for the recording, except it had magnetic heads that came out on it. But the cylinder itself was a sewer pipe. This thing stood about 8 feet tall. It had this massive concrete sewer pipe that spun at something like 1,200 RPM, and it would walk. It had to be bolted to the floor because as the earth turned, this thing would walk across the raised floor.
Yeah, worrying about Coriolis faults in your disk drives probably that's quite seriously old school. That is, isn't it? So,
Yeah, no kidding.
so how's the weather with you now, Larry? Is it warmed up?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's going to be in the high 70 degrees today.
Oh wow.
Yeah, we got plants and everything's blooming and just going crazy. Looks like
What about
spring
you,
is
Mike?
here.
Is it still frozen cold in the north?
Actually, the lake started to melt a bit. It's supposed to be above freezing all the next 14 days. So, I was laughing with my wife saying we'll have to step the mast this weekend. That's a bit aggressive, but still.
Yeah, but you'll be considering moving back down to the summer house.
Oh yeah, that'll be soon. Pretty much as soon as the lake's open.
Right. That's why you put all your music stuff at that time, right?
Yeah, that we'll move over there. Well, actually, we moved everything because we don't heat over there in the winter. So, after losing a whole pile of electronics over the years, we've decided, okay, we'll just move the stuff.
Yes.
Actually, my wife Kath did look up and discovered something that I hadn't thought of, which is the L in LCD means liquid, and it actually will freeze.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It used to be cholesterol, actually.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, years ago it did. It's yeah.
Anyways, according to, I guess it's Samsung, their TVs are good to about 25 below. Sadly, it gets to about 40 below here.
Does that destroy the display if it freezes then, Mike?
I'm not sure if it actually would or not. We just decided we wouldn't try the test. I should grab an old one and just leave it over there
Yeah,
one
that would
winter.
be interesting to see.
I don't care about it.
Yeah.
So I've got to rush off now and go water my greenhouse, unfortunately. But does anybody want to ask me anything about Fingerer while I'm here for?
I need to see it before I have a good question.
Okay. Well, hopefully back end of this week we'll get that out now. We're hoping for a release, I think, probably on Thursday, aren't we, Kurt, or
Yeah.
Friday? So
Yeah.
if Jim has some luck with those horrible bugs. So
Very good.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks for the demo.
yeah, you're welcome. I hope it
Very
comes
interesting.
up to the promise. So
I have the impression it delivers more than what people were expecting. So.
yes, nothing like raising expectations unreasonably, is there, before it goes out? So. Okay, guys, I'll catch you guys next week.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.